Next, we have a panel entitled The Evolution of Right-Wing Violent Extremism and Terrorism. To discuss this critical and timely topic, which I think will flow nice from Karen and Josh's conversation, we have Michael Isikoff, Chief Investigative Correspondent, Yahoo News, who will introduce his panel.
Does that do it? Okay. I have the panel behind me here. Quite a lot to talk about in this panel. It's the evolution of right-wing violent extremism and terrorism. I have to my left Jason Blazakis, who's a senior research fellow at the Safon Center. And up above me, virtually, we have Nick Rasmussen, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Along with him, Kacper, I hope I pronounce everybody's name right. If I don't get it right, please correct me. Kacper Rekawek.
Kacper.
I'm sorry?
Kacper, like the friendly ghost.
Okay, Kacper, okay. He's the postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo Center for Research on Extremism. We also have Vidhya Ramalingam, who is a founder and CEO of Moonshot, and Vidhya Khan, who's a filmmaker who has done films on right-wing extremism. So a lot of different perspectives here, and Nick, I want to start with you as the guy who was the chief analyst, really, of the terrorism threat in this country for many years, as you were both deputy and director of NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center. The center really grew out of the events of 9/11 and the need to grapple with what was clearly a looming terrorist threat at the time. But I want to ask you, in the years that you were there as deputy and then director, how much time and effort did you devote to the domestic right-wing extremism threat? Was that even within your brief as director of NCTC?
Thanks, Mike, for picking out a sore point right out of the gate there. But I think the way you asked the question and the way I'll answer it, I think will speak a bit to what Josh Geltzer spoke about just a few minutes ago, is the way in which this particular problem set has moved to the fore. The answer to your question, Mike, in 2 words is painfully little. I spent very, very little time as director of the National Counterterrorism Center working the domestic terrorism threat. Some of that was by practice and post 9/11 orientation. Some of that was also just a feature of our system, which had a heavy tilt towards law enforcement solutions in addressing these issues. And I kind of think of it metaphorically. If we were in the White House Situation Room having a conversation about Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of even the homeland dimensions of those overseas terrorist groups, the population around the table would have included literally all of the major national security departments and agencies of government: CIA, FBI, NCTC, Justice Department, State Department, Defense Department, Homeland Security, the list goes on. When you come up to an issue that involved a domestic terror attack, everybody more or less metaphorically pushed themselves back from the table and looked to their left and looked to the right and said, this is FBI's thing. And again, I think that's one of the things that I think is so useful about the work Josh Geltzer highlighted in the last conversation, is that there is a realization that this effort needs to be whole of government, certainly needs to be whole of government, drawing on more than just the traditional national security organizations. Now, to take myself off the hook for that failing, I'll say that just simply, it wasn't, as we dealt with the post 9/11 security re-architecting that we needed to do. The problem set we were trying to solve for was mainly a problem set of information sharing across the foreign and domestic divides, and we invested a tremendous amount of effort in trying to close those gaps in the years since 9/11. Those gaps are well known and well spoken to. I won't go into them. But I think now the problems, if you just simply listen to the way government threat analysts are presenting the threat picture to the American people by way of testimony or other public statements, we are dealing with a much more significant domestic terrorism threat, largely fueled by right-wing extremism of various forms. And that's just demanding a whole different degree of attention, focus, and ultimately resourcing from federal agencies in response.
Although I do have to
I wish
say,
we had done more work to get us there while I was still in government.
Although I do have to say, Nick, this is not a new threat, as Josh Gelzer reminded us in his own talk. But I mean, I remember the 1990s, the Oklahoma City bombings, the militia movement. All the issues that we're talking about today were very much on the table in the aftermath of the horrific bombing at Oklahoma City and the ties to, all extremist, white supremacist groups around. When looking back at it today from, the perspective, how is it that threat that was very front and center in this country at the time kind of just was not on the radar screen when you were at NCTC?
I guess what I would say is that what has changed over that period, Mike, is volume and scale. And volume and scale count for a lot here. And I think two factors have contributed to the volume and scale that Josh was speaking about and that you're alluding to. One of those factors is of course, the online environment, which is just an accelerant, an enabler, a catalyst for the kind of radicalization that Vidhya works with every day at Moonshot. And she can explain, the way in which we try to intervene in that environment. So the online environment clearly is an accelerant and an enabler of this process and has helped create that volume and scale problem I spoke to. The other reality is that the toxic political environment that we are living in the United States right now, and to some degree internationally as well, has also served as an accelerant in feeding various grievance narratives that kind of add to the volume and scale of the problem we're talking about in this panel. So it's not that the problem didn't exist in the 90s. Of course it did. The FBI was deeply focused on a set of different right-wing, far-right extremists during that period. It's volume and scale. And again, hearing Chris Wray publicly talk about the number of open investigations in this area gives you a sense of that volume and scale that wasn't there during the 1990s. But I'm anxious to hear from my fellow panelists on this as well.
Jason, did we take our eye off the ball in focusing on the domestic terrorism threat?
I think that post 9/11, in the wake of the Al-Qaeda attack, the United States focused so much on the global Salafi jihadist threat to the detriment of our focus on other forms of ideological forms of terrorism, to include right-wing terrorism. And that, is still an image, the knocking down of the Twin Towers that is seared in so many minds of government officials. And I will say, in terms of being in the government, as a former government official myself, it takes quite a bit for the United States to pivot from one threat to another threat. In the lead up to 9/11, the United States wasn't focusing on Salafi jihadism and terrorism, focusing on ethno-nationalist groups as the primary area of focus. And then we saw this shift. And I think we're starting to see slowly that shift to right-wing extremism as a focus of the US government. But it's a bit like trying to turn around the Titanic. You have an extremely large bureaucracy, and it's hard to shift the resources, human resources and financial resources, to look at a new kind of threat or a developing threat, because I think we would all acknowledge that it's not new, it's expanded. I agree with Nick on that point.
So you have argued and written that we're sort of the prisoners of the post 9/11 focus on the jihadi threat, and that we do need a domestic terrorism law. Now, as you heard yesterday when I asked Secretary Mayorkas about this, he said he's not convinced we need one. Josh Gelser said essentially it's something we're looking at and, you know, we'll see. Why do you think we need one now? What tools would it give us that the FBI and other law enforcement doesn't already have to prosecute people who commit violent acts of terrorism?
I think we first need a lot more than just a domestic terrorism law, but we do need a domestic terrorism law, and this is where I think I fundamentally am in disagreement with the Homeland Secretary on this point. If you look at the cases that we've been able to pursue in the context of domestic extremism, there are individuals that are absolutely put behind bars for the remainder of their lives, like Dylan Roof, who carried a horrific attack in South Carolina about 6 years ago. Someone like that's going to be behind bars forever. But then on the other hand, you have individuals like Christopher Hassan, the member of the United States Coast Guard, white supremacist to the core, who was planning out attacks against Democratic politicians and members of the so-called liberal media in his worldview. And in the end, he got about 10 years in jail. And if he had been a Salafi jihadist, I wonder, would he have been spending more time behind bars than he is today? He's going to come out and he's still going to be an individual who could carry out some kind of violence in the future. That's just one example. But there are other reasons why, in addition to the additional charges that we could pursue, we actually have a domestic definition of terrorism, but we have no charges surrounding them unless somebody carries out an attack with a weapon of mass destruction. That is the one exception in which an individual can be charged with act of domestic extremism or terrorism. But when the United States goes overseas and tries to politic and use the tools of diplomacy to try to encourage other governments to label their own citizens as terrorists who may be part of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but yet the United States can't label its own individuals who carried out a domestic act of extremism a domestic terrorist, but yet we still call them, we heard Josh call January 6th an act of domestic terrorism, right? But none of those individuals have been charged. It actually makes me...
And Secretary Mayorkas did not want to call the people who committed January 6th terrorists.
Yeah. So
he said he was unwilling to use that word.
Absolutely. It makes me personally uncomfortable that the U.S. government's actually calling people domestic terrorists, but we actually don't have charges that we can levy against them. So there is this hypocrisy also that is very problematic.
But let me just pick up on that, because when you tried to define what it should look like, you wrote that it should be defined as somebody who tries to kill, kidnap, maim, commit, or assault with a dangerous weapon, or destroy property, causing significant risk of serious bodily injury, to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government. That's pretty wide when you think about those words, and is going to encompass a lot of groups across the political spectrum. Antifa, are they covered by your definition of domestic terrorism?
So the definition of domestic terrorism to me has three key elements. The use of violence or threat of violence, the political motivation behind it, and the fear that it could cause within individuals who may be outside the scope of the particular target. So if an individual is carrying out something that fits those three criteria, which are the existing U.S. code, U.S. 18 of the domestic code, there is that definition, and it essentially has those three pillars. If someone does something that actually is in violation of the domestic definition of terrorism, they probably should be charged for something related to the definition. So, yeah, if it's Antifa, individual, absolutely. What I'm not saying, however, is that we should...
So just to break in, the people who are rioting in Portland in the aftermath of George Floyd and in many other cities and destroying property, you would call them terrorists?
I would say they're not necessarily trying to change the political U.S. system. They're not
Well,
trying
they're
to take
protesting a policy. They're protesting the conduct of a government of government, and so therefore, it seems to me they meet your definition.
I mean, it would have to be very contextual, the specific case of that individual, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
you would have to understand the full fact pattern before actually throwing something at them. I mean, a better example is, the January 6th insurrectionists, right?
Right.
Clearly, you had individuals who were politically motivated, carried out an act of violence, and they were trying to change the U.S. system of democracy. and Josh Geltzer, of course, he called it, a definition of terrorism, and he called it a terrorist event, right?
Right.
But we haven't charged them. So what I'm saying is you have the rhetoric in which we say they're carrying out a domestic extremist event that is terrorism, but we don't have that charge. That's problematic.
Let me turn to the other members of the panel to get some of their perspectives. Dia, you've made films about the white supremacist threat and tried to understand, motivations and where they're coming from. Tell us a little bit about what you found in making that film and how you think that fits in with what governmental policy should be to address the issue.
Thank you so much for having me. So yes, I have made multiple films now at this point exploring right-wing extremism in America. So looking at the militia, various militia movements, looking at white supremacist groups, looking at also anti-abortion terrorism, which is something else that's having a resurgence, and also looking at the overlaps of some of these movements. And just going back just a little bit to your earlier question about what is it that is accelerating these movements. What I found is what some of the speakers have already identified, which is obviously the online space is just the perfect sort of pollutant in a way to radicalize more people. But I would say that from every single interview that I've done now with these guys across some of these overlapping movements in America is, I think, the public, the media, and also the political response to and the focus on the jihadist threat has actually been a part of creating this sort of co-radicalization. So while we were all busy looking in that direction, these guys were becoming more and more agitated, more and more frustrated, and more prepared. What so many of them have said to me is that they are preparing for an ultimate war with this influx of people. At the time, right now, it's in their eyes Muslims. And so their posture, in a way, against even their own governments is a posture, and the story that they tell themselves is a posture of self-defense. So they are very much actually taking the government response to this Islamic terrorist threat as a part of their own response and a legitimacy in a way for them to becoming armed. So I think there's that. I think there is a gendered aspect in this that we often overlook in a lot of the conversations that we have, is that, the vast majority, there are obviously women involved in some of these movements as well. But what I have seen in the far-right movement, in contrast to groups like ISIS, for example, is the lack of women. That you do have some women in these movements, but this is predominantly a male movement. So I think there's something there to be explored. Now, in terms of the underlying reasons that I came across and sort of were consistent with a lot of these young men was this sense of dislocation, this sense of not feeling like they belong or have a place within the larger community, within the larger political conversation, feeling unheard, feeling not seen, feeling as if they don't matter, feeling like they don't have a voice, and that one of the only ways that they can reclaim that voice is by doing spectacular events, because we've seen groups like ISIS being rewarded with attention for behavior like that. So I came across, I filmed in Charlottesville. I ended up getting sort of unintentionally stuck there. I filmed with one of the white supremacist groups there. And I constantly heard from them, we want to do what you guys are doing, is what they would say to me, because I'm Muslim. So I'm just getting tarred as, I must be ISIS then. But he was saying, we want to do what you guys are doing. We want soldiers like you guys have. We want our guys to be willing to die in the way that you guys are. So there's this sort of hatred and infatuation with their enemy, which I think is really fascinating. But I do think that despite what it's looking like, and despite the sort of political response and also the law enforcement response to this, I think engagement with these groups is crucial. One of the lessons that I walked away with in doing these films is, if we have direct engagement with these guys, there is actually hope in terms of getting them back out of these movements. it seems impossible. It seems like they're very hardened in their views, but actually they're not. In the course of doing the filming that I did, there are multiple people who have since left and have now become very, very vocal anti-racists. And that's not because of any kind of magical quality that I have, other than just being willing to sit and engage and listen and hear them out and then challenge them. So I think that's something that's quite important and shouldn't be left off the table in terms of solutions.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on that a little bit. When you say engagement, what are we talking about, and how would that translate into governmental policy, if at all?
I think, I think it can be, actually. I think what we need is, internationally, we are comfortable. We in Western northern countries, we're comfortable with reaching out to problematic groups. And what do we call it? We call it diplomacy. Now that we've got this festering problem within our own countries, we are sort of saying, well, let's arrest them, let's do this type of legislation to convict them in this way or in that way. And all of those solutions are very, very important. So I'm for all of that. I'm not critical of that at all. But I think that the reason we also need to have the engagement is that a lot of the people that enter groups like this are sort of on the fence, and they sort of subscribe to this because there's nothing else. There's no other place for them. And what the engagement would look like, in my view, is it cannot just be words about uniting a population. I mean, the US is so, I don't need to tell you this, it's so profoundly, deeply divided. And that divide is only going to be bridged when we put our need to be right at the door, and we focus on the solutions and truly including the people that are on every side of this to the table and speak with them. So how does the engagement look? I think we need to set little teams of people that do engagement within communities. I think we need, I've also done films on foreign fighters on the Muslim side, Muslim extremist side as well. And one of the things that's been so utterly effective there, and I think will be very helpful here, and I'm seeing some signs of it already, is mentors and youth engagement and providing these young men predominantly with an alternative. They have all these feelings, they have all this uncertainty, they have all this now anxiety because of, and loneliness because of COVID as well. It has to find a place. We have to find an alternative place for it. So the policy side of it has to be that there has to be community engagement. We have to set out teams of diplomats, of people who do reconciliation work, people who can work in community conflict situations. But I think if we don't do that, if that direct face-to-face contact is not had by people who are capable of having it, you are going to see these divides and these gulfs deepening and the violence increasing. The amount of work I've done on this issue at this point, I was not surprised to see January 6th at all. In fact, this is going to continue, and you are going to see more random acts of violence happening across the US until we get this right. We have to make sure that we intervene and know that it's possible to get a lot of these people back out of these movements. So exit ramps also have to be there for them.
It does strike me that there's some tension between labeling and prosecuting people as terrorists and trying to engage with them. The one may push away the other. But Vidhya, you've studied this problem at Moonshot and tried to sort of understand better how to turn people away from these hateful ideologies and actions. Can we engage in the way that we've been talking about here? And are there smart strategies that can actually work?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the co-panelists. I absolutely believe that we can engage, and there's a huge amount of evidence that we can draw on to prove that that change is possible. I don't believe that legislation and prevention models to actually pull people out are in contradiction with one another. I think both can and should exist at the same time. Now, one of the benefits that we have, as many of you have mentioned, this is not a new problem at all. This is a problem that's existed for many decades. In Europe in particular, there are decades of offline prevention and intervention models and learnings from decades of those models, which can be applied not only in the offline space, but also in the online space. And this is really the core of what Moonshot's been testing over the last several years. There is a raft of evidence which demonstrates the efficacy of behavioral health models when reaching out to individuals that are on the path towards a violent extremist movement. And that not only applies when it comes to right-wing extremism, that also applies across the spectrum when we're talking about Salafi jihadism or other forms of extremism as well. Some of that evidence goes back to the 1990s, the early 2000s. It predates 9/11, predates the terrorism prevention infrastructures that we've built in a post-9/11 context, and has shown the efficacy of, for example, one-to-one counseling, social work methods, exit programs which try and pull people into a case management system and build a new life for them outside of the movement. So there's a huge amount of evidence we can build on, and I would really urge any colleagues in the US to really be looking at the evidence from Europe on this. We don't need to be starting from scratch here. We can be building on evidence. Now, what Moonshot has done is tried to apply those same social work methods, those behavioral health methods in the online space. And we now have pretty substantial evidence to demonstrate that if you engage individuals that are consuming neo-Nazi content, white supremacist content, and offer them safer alternatives, not just in terms of resources that they can access to deal with the ideology, but also in terms of signposting them into services, signposting them into counselors, into exit programs. We now have substantial evidence to show that they are more likely to engage with those essentially offers of assistance than they are with so-called counter-narratives. So, yes, ideology matters. Yes, ideology is important, but we have enough evidence to show us that if we really want to get at the heart of the problem, if we really want to turn people away, we're going to have to deal with the underlying drivers. We're going to have to get at the underlying emotions that have led people into this, and that's going to help us find their path out.
But the elephant in the room on this, which Nick referred to earlier, is social media. And the spread of these, hateful ideologies on social media. And that's where people spend their time. That's where people, get their news, unfortunately, for a big chunk. So all the strategies you're describing sound like they would make sense, and then somebody goes home at night and sees all sorts of, crazy, hate-filled stuff on Facebook and YouTube. Doesn't it sort of undermine what you're trying to accomplish?
I see the online space as much as it is a risk factor and as much as it creates problems for those of us that are trying to do prevention, it also creates an opportunity. Just as those individuals are going online to access their news, to connect with their friends, families, and also connect with people who might be trying to manipulate them or exploit them, they are going online and engaging with content that creates an opportunity for us to directly reach out to them and engage. And I'll give you an example. Last year, Moonshot ran what I would call a de-escalation crisis response campaign, which we ramped up in the run-up to the US election and ran through the election, through the January 6th insurrection, through the inauguration. And we were reaching out to white supremacists, armed group members, QAnon adherents, and also anti-government conspiracy theorists. And we ran, the sheer scale of people engaging content across those 4 different types of audiences, I've never seen volumes of engagement this high. Now, really interestingly, when we ran messaging campaigns to try and reach out to those individuals, de-escalate them from anger, de-escalate them from violence, the most engaging message that we tested with those 4 audiences was a message that said anger and grief can be isolating. So on average, people at risk of right-wing extremism, of anti-government conspiracy theories, they were 17% more likely to click on that message than any others that we tested. And in particular, armed group audiences were more likely to engage with a message that said, don't do something that you'll regret, self-control is key, and offered exercises and self-help resources to de-escalate themselves from anger. So continually, when we engage with these audiences online, we find that not only do they want to engage with extremist and hate content, they are open and receptive to content which is going to try and help them. And that's really the opportunity for us to try and reach out, to use the internet as a mechanism to reach out to them and try and turn them away.
Kacper, you've studied the right-wing extremism problem in Europe. And, the assumption of all the conversation and dialogue about this in the United States is that there's a connection between these groups and acts of violence. And, we certainly saw that in the United States on January 6th. But if I understand correctly, your research suggests that many of these groups and many of these actors, as repugnant as their ideologies might be, don't necessarily engage in violence, and that correct me if I'm wrong, your argument is that the threat of violence from these groups has been overstated.
Yes, thank you for the question, Michael, and I guess time for a European point of view, if I could put it this way, continental Europe point of view. Well, we're sitting at CIREX, at a data that basically says that in Western Europe, in the last year, there were 2 fatal right-wing terrorist attacks. One in Germany, one in Portugal. 2. 140 severe incidents of violence, and I can explain what we mean by severe, but 140 of which most were kickings and beatings. Now, how does that square with the description of the panel? How does that square with the situation in the United States? I guess, in the output, not in the input that Vidhya was talking about, but we're talking about the output, the violent output here. And what we've been seeing quite a lot, not only here at CIREX, but many of my other colleagues in Europe, up and down Europe as well, is that we too often think of these individuals on the extreme right, because it's not only the far right, it's the tip of the spear, so to speak, as, we still have this kind of a quasi-skinhead image, that they would be involved in violence first and foremost. Whereas quite a lot of that stuff, and I talked to some of them, they are quite keen on actually going cultural. They want to repeat the success, how they view it, of the new left after 1968, which in their view, that's how they see it, went into mainstream culture, politics, society, etc., and basically won the battles of 1968, which it lost in 1968, but won in the long term, and the new right, so to speak, they want to repeat that success, and they call it metapolitics. I know it's a language and a word that people in the community know, but I guess the language, the audience here need to hear it. So they go metapolitical, not essentially violent. And maybe one last thought, Michael, if I may. A French foreign fighter from the far right who fought in Ukraine told me in an interview, he said, I would love to have Donbass or Donetsk in France. I would love to have that kind of violence, revolution, for his ideology, for his far right ideology, but I know I will not. We are too weak. The state is too strong. The state will unleash all of its totalitarian means against us, and we will simply not prevail. Therefore, we have to seek another way. Therefore, we have to seek a kind of like a back door or a side door, really, and go into your minds, go into your politics, go into your, bedrooms, living rooms, through culture. That's what they're looking for. That's how I see the pendulum. Less violence, more thinking. Even if we disagree with this thinking, it's still what they're doing, and that's how we see it.
Okay. Let me go back to Nick. We've talked a lot at this conference about January 6th. Were the people who were committed the riot at the Capitol on January 6th terrorists?
Well, that's a pretty broad question, Michael, and I think the word "the people," captures a whole lot, or quite a spectrum of activity.
680 people were arrested.
Sure, and you're seeing an array of charges being rolled out over time, and there's been some great journalistic reporting on unpacking all of that. So I think I would tend to agree with where Josh left it. This was clearly an act of domestic terror, taken in its totality. Was every single individual arrested? Someone who fell under the label of terrorist? I'm not sure that's a productive conversation to really have. I think we had a whole spectrum of human behavior on display that day, from people who are actively engaged in violence that caused real harm and even in some cases may have contributed to the death of individuals at the Capitol, And then you had other people who were clearly caught up in a moment or a movement or a frenzied sense of excitement about something they thought might be unfolding. Like I said, that's a tremendous spectrum. But I think what it made clear was that this ideological narrative that is pulsing through our politics right now can manifest in violence, and that is itself, plenty of reason enough for us to be thinking about trying to drive solutions to this. And I want to kind of go back to something Dia mentioned earlier. This ends up being a solution that you can't lay at the feet of any one sector or any one group of actors. Josh Geltzer will try to organize government activity in this space, but clearly there's a role for the private sector, there's a role for civil society organizations, there's a role for academia in trying to understand the true contours and nature of this far-right extremism problem. And that's one of the things I'm doing at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, is trying to provide that platform for multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder conversation and problem solving in this space. And I'll tell you, Mike, it's something that was way outside my comfort zone in government service, trying to sit around the table with all of these different sectors, all of whom have something real to contribute in a problem solving way. You're not used to that when you work in an intelligence organization or in the government. You tend to think of this as your problem to solve. And clearly this is a societal problem requiring a whole of society response. And that's why I think this panel reflects that. We've got members of the private sector, members of academia, and government veterans. And I think each of us brings something to this that's going to help us chip away at this problem.
One big fuel or accelerant, which I mentioned before, is the role of social media. And we had the really remarkable testimony recently of Frances Hogan, the Facebook whistleblower, who talked about how Facebook's own algorithms maximized the spread of hateful ideologies that clearly can induce and lead people to violence. Nick, I want to ask you, and then Jason, you to respond here, but basically the argument is that governmental action now is required to get these social media giants to take greater steps to curb the kind of content they allow on their platforms. Does the situation cry for cracking down on Facebook and Twitter and the other social media platforms in your view, Nick?
I'm not sure I'd frame it that way, Mike. I mean, cracking down. I think there are clearly some parts of the extremism landscape where I think companies would benefit and even welcome greater government clarity in terms of prescribing certain groups, certain activity, certain forms of expression in the online environment. We've seen over time the companies respond most effectively when there's a clear framework provided in some cases by government. So during the ISIS foreign fighter heyday of several years ago, it was a crime for an individual to be posting on social media activities supportive of ISIS or indicating an intention to go to the conflict zone to become a foreign fighter. Why? Because the Islamic State had been declared a foreign terrorist organization. And so there was, in a sense, no optionality for the way in which a technology platform could evaluate a person's participation tied to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. We lack a similar framework across this domestic set of actors and organizations. And that was certainly a part of the conversation that Karen Greenberg and Josh Geltzer had. The absence of that framework leaves much more gray space. And whenever there is gray space, there is a lack of consistency, there is a lack of uniformity in the way in which companies can respond to that, and that leads to criticism, justifiably so. But that's one of the reasons for that multi-stakeholder conversation I talked about a few minutes ago. Let's try to come up with better definitional frameworks that give us guideposts, guidelines to make decisions like this, rather than just relying on feel.
So if you were back in your old job, how would you clarify that gray space? What would you recommend?
Well, I'm going to do my successors the courtesy of not telling them how to do their job currently. And I myself, I'll be the first to admit I've gone back and forth on the wisdom or virtue of a domestic terrorism statute. I've written publicly a couple of years ago that it was, highly called for and would add great value, but I'm now inclined to be more nuanced in making that claim because I just don't know what I don't know in terms of what capacity it would unleash or unlock for the government to bring to the table from a law enforcement perspective. So I'm going to dodge that one, Michael, because I just don't want to be prescriptive when I don't necessarily have the full picture that my government colleagues have. I do think that the more that the government can do to put some definitional frameworks around terrorism or extremism or violent extremism, the more those can be consistently applied by tech companies. I think I can leave it at that.
On the social media front, Jason, because you've studied this as well, what actions, if any, are needed by the U.S. government to address the issues that Frances Haugen was testifying about?
So one thing that the U.S. government can do to help social media, as opposed to perhaps stick the sword in social media, is to consider using the tools that they have available to them. The U.S. Department of State and Treasury Department can sanction terrorist groups pursuant to various legal authorities.
And yet they have not.
With one exception, the Russian imperial movement.
Which was done under the Trump administration,
Correct.
not the Biden administration.
Correct. And I'll just say, when the State Department designated the Russian imperial movement on April 6th of 2020, on April 7th of 2020, the Russian imperial movement's YouTube channel disappeared, and the Facebook page associated with the Russian imperial movement also disappeared, because these social media companies quite often look at the US designation list to make their determinations on whether or not content can ride on their platform associated with these kinds of groups. So one thing the State and Treasury Department can do is consider using their tools to go after transnational white supremacist groups, and that may give more leverage for social media to take down content. But social media has a lot more to do on its own, I would argue, and they can do more on their own without the government impetus to push them to do more. And I'll just point to one analogy. In 1970, the Anti-Money Laundering Bank Secrecy Acts were passed. And banks then became responsible for trying to get dirty money out of their system. And I look like there's an analogy to me that essentially you have content moderation teams at Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, supposed to be removing content. And they've been really aggressively doing that only really since the rise of ISIS. When ISIS material was riding on their platforms, you could see decapitation videos. And then they finally responded. So it's a really immature process. It's been around for 8 years, whereas taking action against dirty money has been around for more than 50 years. They need to build up their content moderation capabilities. They need to continue to work with private sector entities like Moonshot, for instance. They need to work with academics who have the experience and understanding of coded language to be able to understand what's being said on their platforms, because a lot of times the people who are the content moderators don't understand how their platform is being used by individuals who are communicating in coded language.
But do we leave that up to the geeks in Silicon Valley?
Well,
we let them decide what we can read and what we can't?
The only thing that Silicon Valley responds to, and I live in Silicon Valley's back door, and I work with Silicon Valley companies all the time, is the impact something could have on their pocketbook. The reputational risk that they face if they allow this content to continue to essentially ride on their platform. And the one way to stop that, to put some kind of limited stop to it, is by calling them to Congress to testify, and hopefully nothing like we saw 2 years ago when Zuckerberg was testifying, in front of senators who are completely out of touch with these issues. But to put their feet on the fire day after day. Do I think regulation is necessary in this space? Possibly. Even Monica Bicker, in the wake of this scandal, said they'd be happy to be regulated more on these issues. Do we need to have more specific regulations in place like we have with money laundering and terrorism financing that we have had in place for 50 years for thinking about how content is spreading on these platforms? I think that is a possibility that needs to be looked at. And one way to look at it is to re-examine Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act to see if it needs to be updated. Because
how would you update it? And explain, Section 230 is basically what immunizes the social media companies from being sued for libel because they are not responsible for the content that
That's
they
right.
allow on their platforms.
Yeah, so there are a couple good bills in Congress to try to address some of these issues. Particularly one area where I would focus on is the area of algorithmic radicalization. A lot of the algorithms that recommend the next YouTube video to watch, the next Facebook group to follow, the next Twitter social star to follow. These are things the algorithm recommends to you. And there are documented examples. In 2019, New York Times did a great story about a guy named Caleb Daniels who became radicalized over YouTube. And I think having a bill that penalizes social media for algorithmic radicalization is a good step. And there is a bill in Congress to do that, to allow for private citizens to potentially sue individuals at these social media companies if they find that somebody has been radicalized through the algorithm. So that would be one way to do so. It would be focused, very nuanced focused, but I also, at the same time, am really concerned about taking too broad of approach to reforming Section 230, particularly along the lines that Donald J. Trump recommended, last year. That's just too broad of a reform.
He had his own motivations
Yes.
for that. Dio, in your research for the film you made, what role did social media play in fueling the ideologies of the people you were making the film about?
It was essential, but I would not just single out the sort of the delivery system and also obviously the algorithm side of it, but the content that a lot of them consumed. And some of them said very clearly, I filmed with a militia member who plotted to blow up an apartment complex filled with Somali Muslims. And he said very clearly that what radicalized him was political rhetoric in his country at the time. How Muslims were being spoken about, how immigrants were being spoken about, what kind of policies and what kind of political rhetoric was just on repeat, rinse and repeat on our traditional media was actually a huge factor in radicalizing and pushing this man then to harder, if you want to say, or more radical content online. So, and also right in the aftermath of 9/11, just I think about 10 days after that, there was a white supremacist that went on a shooting spree, killed two immigrants who he was hoping were Muslim, but actually ended up being Indian. One young Muslim man actually survived the attack, and then campaigned to save this man's life. And in the process of learning more about his attacker, what he found out, and this man, this white supremacist, Mark Stroman is his name, actually also said that watching widely available media, Fox News in his case, and constantly seeing Muslims or sort of the outgroup in a way portrayed and painted in a certain way is what he said, it just drove me over the edge. He said, I had to do something. How can I not do something? So I'm not saying that we should start, I know we're talking about social media. Should we police social media? Should we have more restrictions in terms of what people can and can't say? I'm not suggesting we do the same with media or with politicians, but I just think it's very important to keep all of these factors in line and in our sight when we are looking at the solutions to this. So yeah, I would say social media is a huge factor, but it's not the only factor. And social media, as Vidhya was saying earlier, in fact, I think can be deployed as part of the solution where some of this engagement online can happen. Recruiters for ISIS at the time, they were spending hundreds of hours trying to recruit one person. So imagine our response in contrast to that is nothing, or very, very little. So the engagement, I will keep saying it, the engagement is critical. And the engagement is not, some of my friends sort of go, why do you keep engaging with all these horrible guys, is what my friends say. Why are you trying to rescue their humanity? And to me, it's not actually about their humanity. It's about my own. I'm trying to hold on to my own. And I think as a society, as various communities, as various countries, we at some point also have to decide, how do we want to show up and face some of these challenges that we have? Do we become like the people that we say we're trying to contain and redirect their energies, or are we offering an alternative? We always say, a friend of mine always says this, we are so good at articulating what we are against. We have to start becoming good at articulating what we are for. That's what all extremist movements do. Whatever window dressing they dress themselves in, whatever slogans and flags they wrap themselves in, they all articulate what they're for. And all we do is react to them, saying we're against that and we're against that. We have to offer our young people an alternative, and we have to offer them a free space the ability to say out loud even the ugly things that they think, so that they can be confronted and so that they can be unpicked. The solution to bad speech is not to restrict speech, it is to have more good speech. So my line, back to your earlier question, the freedom of expression question, the only thing that I think the line for me is if you're inciting violence, that's the line. I think beyond that, we have to do a better job at countering the bad speech and becoming better at articulating what kind of society and what kind of future is it that we want for our young people. So that extremists are not let to define it for our young people.
So, Vidhya, just returning to the issue of engagement, I wonder if we could just flesh this out a little more. What do you say, how do you engage with somebody who is expressing racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim language? How do you engage with somebody like that? What do you say to them that you think could bring them out of that morass of hatred?
Well, it's critical to, as much as possible, draw lines between the level of risk and the type of threat that we're dealing with each individual case. Someone who is purely racist and is maybe building, developed ideas off the back of racist views that they've been exposed to is different from someone who is embedded in a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist movement. And the intervention that's going to be required is going to look different. So this exists, the risk exists on a spectrum, and our responses have to look different depending on where someone sits on that spectrum. For a hardened ideologue, for an organizer of an extremist movement, these are folks that require a targeted intervention. So referral into support programs, some of those behavioral health methods that I mentioned, counseling, and potentially off-ramping into exit programs. And of course, if someone does something that crosses the line and warrants a criminal justice intervention, warrants legal action, then obviously that needs to be taken. My view is anyone below that threshold, anyone who has not done something illegal, is someone who who we can reach and try and bring back and pull back from that line. Below that line, if you have supporters, people who are not actually committed but are just engaging with the ideology online, they are ripe for targeted prevention efforts online. And these are people who may have a lot to lose by engaging more actively with these movements. They may actually alienate themselves from their family members, from their loved ones. These are audiences who might be receptive to what I'd call deterrence messaging, diversion. They might be open to messaging about the consequences of engaging. And then there's, one level below that, there's the general public who are coming into contact with disinformation, propaganda, whose opinions may be swayed, but who don't necessarily pose a national security threat on their own. And the efforts to engage with those individuals might include building their critical media consumption skills, inoculating them to harmful content, preparing them for the possibility that they might be manipulated online. And those efforts need nothing to do with terrorism prevention. That's more about building resilience. So the intervention for someone who is maybe, saying some racist things, maybe getting involved in anti-Semitism, that intervention is going to look very different from how we might intervene with a neo-Nazi.
So, Kacper, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the engagement that Vidhya is talking about, because if I heard you correctly the first time around, you cited as something that worked the guy in Ukraine who didn't engage in violence because of the threat that the state was going to come down on him hard, that he was going to end up in jail, that he was going to be prosecuted. And that's what you said worked. That's very different than the kind of engagement that Vidhya is talking about.
Thank you, Michael. It's slightly different. It was a Frenchman who came back from fighting in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, who had gone there to fight on behalf of the Russians, I'm assuming, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And came back, said, look, we would stand no chance. And, I'll wear the devil's advocate hat, if I could. When I talk to these individuals, I think we have a bit of an issue here. They differ in their understanding of European history or Western history, culture, and society quite remarkably from us. We might get them not to do violence, and here I completely endorse what Dia or Vidhya were talking about. But I don't think we can de-radicalize them. I don't think that's on the menu. These individuals think that the last 350 years of European or Western history, so basically post-Enlightenment, is just a joke. It's basically a stab in the heart of traditional white, male-dominated, properly, in their view, organized and run Europe, and therefore we need to go back to that. Now, try having a conversation with someone who completely rejects the last 350 years and tells you that the French Revolution was basically the worst horrible thing that happened, that ancien regime of Louis was great, that serfdom was great because people knew their place. And he's not going to do violence, and it's usually a he. I agree with Vidhya, who was talking about that. But basically, we have an issue here. We have to go back to the roots of our enlightened democracies and check where things got wrong, where the rot is, so that individuals like that can be convinced that this world is not rotten. But I wouldn't be so, optimistic as to, getting them back on the right track. I think they would be offended by us actually saying that we need to get them back on some kind of a right track. They say, hey, I've got legitimate views. They're just different from yours. That's what they've been telling me. And I think when we talk about engagement, you just have to listen to what they say and have to give them space. That's what I'm trained, as an academic to do, and not to be judgmental about this. And I think that's the one thing we can do, and then share the views and the light on this, that there is a group of people amongst us that is basically so anti what we are, and they're not coming from, from nowhere. I mean, there is some logic behind, but as I said, it's a logic of rejection of 350 years of Western or European history.
Dia, I see you have, you want to break in. Go ahead.
Well, it's just, well, Kacper, what you're saying is absolutely so important. And this is why I would like to just make a very quick comment about, when I say engagement, I completely agree with you. The engagement cannot take place from all the interviews that I've done with these guys. It cannot be my ideology, my worldview versus yours. It cannot be me trying to blame them, to change them, to try to de-radicalize them, or to try to get them on the right path. You do that with any of these groups. It doesn't matter if it's the jihadis versus the white supremacists versus the whoever. You will lose. It's a losing conversation. The only way to do this is the only way that people that recruit them into these groups do. They don't start with the ideology. Ideology is never first for most of them. It's about the human relationship. So my kind of method with all of these guys has been to establish a personal relationship, a human connection with them first, and way, way, way down the line, because the patience has to be here. We have to be willing to give these guys and ourselves the time to do this. These guys didn't appear out of a vacuum and didn't get radicalized in 2 days. So to get them back is also going to take time, but it can only be done through human relationships. It cannot be, you are now going to think like me. I think, Kacper, what you're saying is the key to engagement, I have found, is listening. It's not talking at people, it's not lecturing them, it's not trying to change them. It's giving them the space to say out loud what they feel, what they think, and not agree with it, not give it permission necessarily, or justify it, but I instead of saying, because some of these guys that I filmed with, they said, oh, the Holocaust never happened, this didn't happen, that didn't happen, blah, 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 slavery is this in America, and whatever. And it's all, and I let them speak, and instead of correcting them, I then told them about my life and my personal experiences. So you make it as intimate, keep it intimate as much as possible. And in that gap of intimate human connection, something different starts happening. I never told them you being a neo-Nazi is a bad thing. They got to that conclusion themselves. Actually, one of them, it took him 2 years. He was the leader of one of the largest neo-Nazi and one of the oldest neo-Nazi organizations in America. And 2 years after we had spent a lot of time together, he called me and he said, look, I can't do this anymore, but I don't know what to do now. So that goes back again to the exit ramp that the video is talking about. Anyway, but I think what you just said is so important, that it's not my ideology, my verse against your verse.
So just to wrap up here, if we've framed this, or at least we've been talking about, on the one hand, engagement, and on the other hand, prosecution, imprisonment. Nick, which is more effective at this point in dealing with the nature of the white supremacist, violent extremist threat the country is facing?
I would argue that's a false choice. I think getting back to something both Dia and Vidhya have said, we need kind of a full toolkit here. Meet the bad guy where he is. In some cases, that will be after he's crossed the line, and you have to have a securitized response that involves incarceration and all that comes with that. But for other individuals who are maybe dabbling in this space and can be walked away from it either through a deterrence or engagement strategy that makes them realize the costs are too high, personally, professionally, whatever, then, I mean, again, this is why this is, in some ways, a harder problem in going after Al-Qaeda cells in the Fatah. This requires a much more nuanced toolkit response. And I think just the nature of this panel shows that you've got to draw on very, very different and unique capabilities across society to have a chance at kind of getting to that good outcome.
Well, on that note, we are now officially out of time, but I do think that we've definitely presented some diverse perspectives on this issue, and something that we'll spend a lot of time talking and thinking about. So thanks to all my panelists, and thanks for everybody for listening.